December 16, 1944, 0500 hours, Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen ground trembled as German artillery shells screamed overhead, each impact sending geysers of earth and snow into the pre-dawn darkness. Private First Class Calvin Booker Graham pressed himself deeper into his foxhole, his hands shaking not from fear, but from a secret that could get him court-martialed at any moment. He was 14 years old. The Wehrmacht's massive offensive, Operation Watch on Rhine, had caught the American forces completely by surprise. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to defend the critical crossroads at Bastogne, had arrived with minimal ammunition, limited medical supplies, and no winter clothing. Among them was a baby-faced farm boy from Texas who had lied about everything to get here. Calvin had altered his birth certificate with his mother's old typewriter, practiced deepening his voice for weeks, and stuffed newspaper in his boots to appear taller. The recruiting sergeant in Houston had looked at him skeptically, but said nothing. America needed soldiers. Calvin needed to escape the endless cotton fields and his father's belt. What the sergeant couldn't have known, what Calvin himself didn't know, was that this scrawny kid who'd never been more than 20 miles from his family's farm possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it arrived, or, growing up hunting rattlesnakes in the Texas brush, had given him instincts that no training manual could teach. As German forces tightened their grip around Bastogne, those instincts were about to save 2,300 men from annihilation. The journey to this frozen hell had begun 8 months earlier on a spring morning in Polk County, Texas. Calvin Booker Graham woke before dawn on April 3, 1944, the same as every day since he could remember. His father needed the fields plowed before breakfast. His mother needed water hauled from the well. His younger siblings needed feeding. At 14, Calvin had the weathered hands of a man twice his age. Years of working the family's struggling cotton farm had built lean muscle across his shoulders and arms, but it was his face that betrayed him. No amount of hard labor could disguise the smooth cheeks and bright eyes of adolescence. The previous night, he'd made his decision while listening to his father's drunken rage echo through their three-room shack. The belt had whistled through the air, catching Calvin across the back for some imagined transgression. As he'd bitten down on his pillow to keep from crying out, Calvin decided he'd rather face German bullets than spend another day under his father's roof. The Austin American-Statesman newspaper had arrived that morning, 3 days late, as always. The front page screamed about Allied victories in Italy and preparations for the invasion of France. A recruitment advertisement promised adventure, training, and 3 hot meals daily. To a farm boy who often went to bed hungry, it sounded like paradise. Calvin walked into the Houston recruiting station on April 15, 1944. He'd practiced his story for days. Born April 11, 1926. That made him 18, old enough to enlist without parental consent. The recruiter, a grizzled sergeant named Morrison, who'd seen action in North Africa, studied the birth certificate Calvin had carefully doctored. The document was convincing. Calvin's mother, a schoolteacher before marriage, had ruined her prospects, had shown him how to use her old typewriter to change the year. The paper's age was right. The county seal looked legitimate. Only the numbers were lies. Sergeant Morrison stared at Calvin for a long moment. The kid was small, maybe 5 feet 6 inches, and couldn't weigh more than 120 pounds. His voice occasionally cracked when he spoke. But Morrison had quotas to meet, and the invasion everyone knew was coming would need every rifle. "You ever fired a weapon, son?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir. Been hunting since I was 8. Deer, hogs, coyotes. I'm a good shot." This, at least, was true. Calvin had been shooting his grandfather's .30-06 rifle since he was tall enough to hold it steady. He could hit a running jackrabbit at 200 yards and had once killed a wild boar that charged his younger brother. Morrison nodded slowly. Stripped down for medical examination. The doctor who examined Calvin barely looked up from his clipboard. Height, 5 feet 7 inches, a generous measurement. Weight, 125 pounds. probably accurate, after Calvin loaded his pockets with rolls of nickels. Vision, 20/20. Hearing, excellent. Reflexes, exceptional. Any scars or identifying marks? The doctor asked. Calvin hesitated. His back bore the crosshatch pattern of his father's belt. Some scars fresh, others years old. Farm accident, sir. Got caught in some barbed wire when I was younger. The doctor noted it without comment. On April 16, 1944, Calvin Booker Graham became the property of the United States Army. He was issued boots 2 sizes too large, uniforms that hung loose on his frame, and a serial number that would follow him into history. Basic training at Camp Hood, Texas, revealed something unexpected. Calvin was a natural soldier. What he lacked in size and strength, he compensated for with uncanny awareness and lightning reflexes. On the rifle range, he qualified expert on his first attempt, scoring 49 out of 50 possible points. His drill sergeant, a massive man named Kowalski, who'd fought at Kasserine Pass, pulled Calvin aside after a training exercise. "Graham, how'd you know that simulated artillery was coming in on Grid Square 4 Baker?" Calvin didn't know how to explain it. He'd just felt something wrong about that area, the same way he'd always known when a copperhead was hiding in the tall grass back home. "Just seemed like the logical place, Sergeant." Kowalski studied him with new interest. "You got good instincts, kid. Real good. Army needs men who can think and feel the battlefield." If you're finding this story as incredible as I am, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this amazing true story. Hit that subscribe button right now. By July 1944, Calvin had completed infantry training and been assigned to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The assignment terrified and thrilled him. Paratroopers were elite. They jumped from aircraft behind enemy lines. They fought outnumbered and surrounded. They were, as their own propaganda claimed, the best America had to offer. Calvin was still 14 years old. The training intensified immediately. Jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, pushed Calvin to his limits. The first time he stood in the aircraft door at 1,000 feet, looking down at the Georgia countryside far below, his breakfast threatened to make a reappearance. "Move out, Graham!" the jumpmaster bellowed. Calvin closed his eyes and stepped into nothing. The opening shock of the parachute nearly jerked him out of his boots. Wind roared past his ears. The ground rushed up to meet him. He hit hard, rolled as trained, and came up laughing with pure adrenaline and relief. 5 jumps later, Calvin earned his silver wings. The ceremony took place on August 23, 1944. He stood at attention while the commanding officer pinned the parachutist badge to his chest, unaware that the Army had just qualified a 14-year-old for airborne combat operations. The 506th PIR deployed to England in September. The crossing aboard the USS George Washington took 8 days through submarine-infested waters. Calvin spent most of the voyage topside, unable to tolerate the packed conditions below deck, where 3,000 soldiers shared space designed for 1,000. He wrote letters home that he never sent. What could he say? "Dear Ma, I lied to join the Army, and now I'm heading to Europe to jump out of airplanes into combat. Hope the cotton crop is good this year." The letters remained folded in his pack, unsent confessions to a mother who probably didn't miss him. England in September 1944 was a vast armed camp. The 506th PIR joined the 101st Airborne Division at Camp Mourmelon near Reims, France. The division had just returned from Operation Market Garden in Holland, bloodied but intact. Veterans told stories of fighting at Normandy, of desperate battles in the hedgerows, of German 88mm guns that could kill a Sherman tank at 2,000 yards. Calvin listened and learned. He kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. The other men accepted him as just another replacement, another farm kid who'd probably die in his first firefight. Nobody suspected he was young enough to be in junior high school. Training continued through October and November. The 101st drilled relentlessly on small unit tactics, weapons maintenance, and physical conditioning. Calvin excelled at all of it. His small size made him ideal for scouting. His sharp eyes could spot camouflaged positions others missed. His steady hands made him the platoon's designated marksman. On December 10th, the division received 72-hour passes. Most men headed to Paris for wine and women. Calvin, unable to drink legally even by his fake age, and terrified someone would discover his secret, volunteered for guard duty. He spent 3 days walking perimeter, writing unsent letters, and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. December 16th, 1944 changed everything. Calvin was cleaning his M19 rifle when the alert came. All passes canceled. Full combat load. Move out in 30 minutes. The scramble was controlled chaos. Men rushed to pack gear, draw ammunition, and say hurried goodbyes to French girlfriends they'd likely never see again. Nobody knew where they were going or why. Rumors spread through the ranks. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive. American forces were surrounded. The situation was desperate. The 506th PIR loaded onto trucks at 1800 hours. The convoy rolled through the night toward Belgium. Calvin sat wedged between two veterans, trying to look calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. His first real combat. Everything until now had been training. They reached Bastogne at 0300 hours on December 19th. The town was already surrounded. German forces had advanced so quickly that the 101st had driven directly into the forming pocket. As the men dismounted from trucks, artillery shells began falling on the crossroads. Calvin's first combat experience was diving face first into frozen mud as hot metal fragments whined overhead. Someone screamed. Medics ran toward the sound. The war had found him. For the next 6 hours, Calvin's unit dug foxholes in the frozen ground and established defensive positions on the eastern edge of town. The work was brutal. The ground was frozen solid, forcing soldiers to use explosives to break through before they could dig. German artillery fell randomly, killing and wounding men with impersonal efficiency. By dawn on December 19th, Calvin understood that everything they'd told him about war was both true and inadequate. Yes, it was loud and confusing and terrifying, but no training could prepare you for the smell of blood on snow, the sound of wounded men crying for their mothers, or the knowledge that you might die before lunch. His platoon leader, Lieutenant James Morrison, gathered the men as weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Morrison was 22 years old, a college graduate who'd joined up after Pearl Harbor. He looked ancient to Calvin. Listen up. The situation is simple. We're surrounded. Supply lines are cut. Weather's too bad for airdrops. We hold this position until Third Army breaks through or we run out of ammunition. Questions. Hostile. Private First Class Danny Torres raised his hand. Torres was 19 from Los Angeles and had survived Normandy. What happens if we run out of ammunition, sir? Then we throw rocks, Morrison said flatly. But we don't retreat. The Germans want this crossroads. We're not giving it to them. Understood? Yes, sir. The response came in unison. Calvin's position was on the extreme right flank, where the American line thinned to almost nothing. His foxhole partner was Corporal Mike O'Brien, a veteran from Boston who'd jumped on D-Day. O'Brien had taken one look at Calvin and sighed. "How old are you, kid? And don't give me that 18 nonsense." Calvin's throat tightened. 18, Corporal, just like my papers say." O'Brien snorted. "Right. And I'm Bob Hope. Look, I don't care if you're 12. Can you shoot?" "Yes, Corporal." "Can you follow orders?" "Yes, Corporal." "Can you keep your head down and your mouth shut?" "Yes, Corporal." O'Brien nodded. "Then we'll get along fine. First rule of combat, Grim. When something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Trust your gut. Your gut will keep you alive when your brain freezes up." That advice would save both their lives before the week was out. December 20th brought heavier German probes. Small groups of infantry would advance under covering fire, test the American defenses, then withdraw when they met resistance. Each probe killed or wounded a few more defenders. The mathematics of attrition were working in Germany's favor. Calvin fired his rifle in combat, For the first time that afternoon, a squad of German infantry appeared from the tree line 400 yards away. They moved in short rushes, using cover effectively, advancing on the American position with tactical skill. Lieutenant Morrison called down the line, "Hold fire until 200 yards." Calvin watched through his sights as the Germans came closer. His heart pounded. His hands were steady. The lead German, probably an NCO, based on how he directed the others, reached 200 yards. "Fire!" Morrison shouted. Calvin squeezed the trigger. The M1 kicked against his shoulder. The German dropped. Calvin worked the bolt, acquired another target, fired again. His training took over. Breathe, aim, squeeze, work the bolt, acquire, fire. He put 10 rounds downrange in less than 30 seconds. The German probe fell back, leaving 3 bodies in the snow. O'Brien looked at Calvin with new respect. "You can shoot, kid. Where'd you learn?" "Texas, Corporal. Been hunting since I was 8. "What were you hunting that taught you to shoot like that?" Calvin thought about the wild hogs that could kill a man if cornered, the coyotes that stalked the farm at night, the rattlesnakes that hid in every shadow. Everything that wanted to kill me first. That night, as temperatures dropped below zero, Calvin experienced the misery that would define the siege. No fires allowed. German observers would call artillery on any light. No hot food. Supply situation was critical. Limited ammunition. Every round had to count. He huddled in his foxhole, trying to stay warm by doing isometric exercises. His feet had gone numb hours ago. He couldn't remember what warm felt like. Back home in Texas, it might be 60 degrees this time of year. Here, it was -10 Fahrenheit and dropping. Around midnight, Calvin felt something wrong. He couldn't explain it. Nothing had changed in the darkness. The usual sounds of artillery in the distance, occasional small arms fire from other sectors, men coughing and shifting in nearby foxholes. But something felt different. "Corporal," Calvin whispered, "something's not right." O'Brien, who'd been dozing despite the cold, came instantly alert. "What do you got?" "I don't know. Just feels wrong." O'Brien had enough combat experience to trust instinct over logic. He slithered out of the foxhole and crawled toward Lieutenant Morrison's position 20 yards away. Calvin watched the darkness, every sense straining. Then he heard it. The faintest sound of equipment shifting, metal on metal, men moving in the dark, trying to be quiet. The sound came from directly ahead, maybe 100 yards out. Calvin eased his rifle to his shoulder and waited. The German assault came 15 minutes later, with devastating fury. Hundreds of infantry emerged from the darkness, supported by machine gun fire and mortars. They'd infiltrated to within 50 yards before launching the attack. But O'Brien had warned Morrison. Morrison had alerted the company. When the Germans charged, they ran into withering defensive fire from prepared positions. Calvin fired as fast as he could work the bolt. Muzzle flashes lit the night like strobe lights. Tracers arced back and forth. Men screamed in German and English. The noise was apocalyptic. The attack lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, dozens of German bodies lay in the snow. The American line had bent, but not broken. Calvin had fired 75 rounds, every single one in his basic load. His shoulder was bruised from recoil. His ears rang from muzzle blast. His hands shook from adrenaline. "How'd you know they were coming?" Morrison asked as ammunition was redistributed. Calvin couldn't explain it. "Just felt it, sir, like when a storm's coming back home. You can't see it yet, but you know it's there." Morrison studied him in the darkness. "That feeling saved a lot of lives tonight, Graham. Keep listening to it." December 21st brought no German surrender demands yet, but the noose tightened. American positions came under constant artillery fire. German forces probed every section of the perimeter, searching for weak points. Casualties mounted steadily. The wounded presented an immediate crisis. The division's medical facilities were overwhelmed. Supplies ran critically short. Morphine, bandages, plasma, all were being rationed. Men died from wounds that proper medical care could have saved. Calvin watched medics work with desperate efficiency, moving from casualty to casualty, doing what they could with almost nothing. He saw men die calling for their mothers, saw others accept death with quiet dignity, saw boys younger than his fake age bleed out in the snow. This wasn't the war of movies and propaganda. This was industrial-scale killing, impersonal and efficient. That afternoon, Calvin's instincts triggered again. His platoon had been moved to reinforce a section of line where German pressure was building. The position felt wrong. The sight lines were too open. Cover was inadequate. The approach routes favored attackers. "Lieutenant," Calvin said quietly, "request permission to scout forward." Morrison looked skeptical. "Why?" "This position feels like a trap, sir. Like when you're hunting and you see a clearing that's too perfect. Nothing's ever in those clearings because the smart animals know better." O'Brien backed him up. "Kid's got good instincts, sir. Worth checking." Morrison considered briefly. "Take O'Brien. Be back in 30 minutes." Calvin and O'Brien crawled forward through the snow, moving with the patience Calvin had learned stalking deer. 50 yards ahead, they found what Calvin's instincts had warned about. The Germans had positioned 3 machine gun nests in a perfect crossfire pattern, all aimed at the position Morrison's platoon occupied. Anyone staying in those foxholes would be slaughtered. They crawled back and reported. Morrison immediately relocated the platoon to a more defensible position, 100 yards to the left. 30 minutes later, German artillery plastered their original position with such intensity that nothing could have survived. "How many times you gonna save our asses, kid?" O'Brien asked. Calvin didn't answer. He was too busy being terrified by how close they'd come to annihilation. December 22nd brought the famous German surrender demand and General McAuliffe's one-word reply. When the demand was read to the troops, men laughed despite their desperate situation. "Nuts" perfectly captured the division's attitude. But laughter didn't change the mathematics. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Food was down to 1 meal daily. No resupply could get through. The weather kept aircraft grounded. The situation was approaching critical. That night, Calvin was pulled from the line for a special assignment. Lieutenant Morrison had recommended him for scout duty based on his instincts and marksmanship. Captain Peters, the company commander, wanted to brief him personally. "Graham, we need eyes on the German positions to our east. Intelligence thinks they're massing for a major push. I need to know where, when, and with what force." "Can you do it?" Calvin's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir." "You'll take Corporal O'Brien and a Private Torres. Move out at 2200 hours. Radio check every 30 minutes. If you're compromised, evade and return. We can't afford to lose men on intelligence gathering." "Questions?" "No, sir." Peter studied him. "How old are you really, Graham?" Calvin's heart stopped. 18, sir. Says so on my enlistment papers." "Right." Peters didn't believe him, but didn't press. "Get some rest. You move out in 6 hours." If this story has you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the incredible conclusion. Trust me, you need to see how this ends. The scout mission launched at 2200 hours. Calvin, O'Brien, and Torres crawled through German lines using a drainage ditch that provided concealment. The temperature had dropped to -15 Fahrenheit. Moving slowly to avoid detection, it took 2 hours to travel 800 yards. What they found changed everything. In a forest clearing 2 kilometers east of Bastogne, the Germans had assembled a massive force. Through binoculars, Calvin counted at least 30 tanks, probably Panthers based on their size and shape, hundreds of infantry, artillery pieces being positioned. This wasn't a probe. This was the main assault. O'Brien whispered into the radio, relaying coordinates and force estimates to headquarters. The response came back immediately. Hold position. Observe. Report any movement. For 6 hours, the 3 Americans lay in the snow watching German preparations. Calvin had never been so cold. His feet were numb, his hands barely functioned, ice formed on his eyelashes. But he kept watching, kept counting, kept noting details that might save lives. Around 0400 hours, Calvin felt it again. That wrongness, not from the German position they were watching, but from behind them, from the direction of American lines. "Something's wrong," he whispered. Back toward our lines. Something's happening. O'Brien looked at him. Torres looked at him. They'd learned to trust the kid's instincts. "What do you feel?" O'Brien asked. "Germans moving through our lines. I think they're trying an infiltration." It seemed impossible. They were watching the main German force. How could Germans be behind them? But O'Brien radioed it in anyway. The response was immediate. Multiple units reporting German infantry in American rear areas. Infiltrators had used the darkness and confusion to penetrate the perimeter. They were trying to cause chaos before the main assault. "Headquarters wants us back now," O'Brien said. "Fast and quiet is over. We run." They ran. German sentries spotted them almost immediately. Rifle fire cracked through the darkness. A machine gun opened up, tracers chasing them through the snow. Torres went down with a scream, hit in the leg. Calvin and O'Brien grabbed him, one arm each, and dragged him toward American lines. Bullets kicked up snow around them. A mortar round exploded 30 yards to their left. Calvin's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. But he kept running. They burst through American lines at 0430, identified themselves between gasps, and collapsed. Torres was evacuated immediately. O'Brien and Calvin reported to Captain Peters. "The Germans are coming," O'Brien said. 30+ tanks, maybe 1,000 infantry, artillery support. They'll hit at dawn." "And there are infiltrators in our rear," Calvin added. "Don't know how many, but enough to cause problems." Peters nodded grimly. "Get ammunition and get back to your positions. It's going to be a long day." Calvin had just enough time to reload his magazines when the German artillery barrage began. For 90 minutes, shells rained on American positions with methodical precision. Calvin crouched in his foxhole, hands over his ears, praying each screaming shell would hit somewhere else. When the barrage lifted at 0615, Calvin risked a look over the lip of his foxhole. Through the smoke and snow, he saw them coming. Dozens of German tanks rolling forward in loose formation, infantry following in their wake. The entire line was advancing. This was it. The battle everyone knew would decide Bastogne's fate. American artillery, what little they had left, opened fire. Tank destroyers engaged from concealed positions. Infantry fired at will. The noise was beyond anything Calvin had experienced. Every weapon in the division seemed to be firing simultaneously. A Panther tank crashed through the tree line 300 yards from Calvin's position. Its 75mm gun traversed toward them. O'Brien grabbed Calvin and threw him flat as the tank fired. The shell passed overhead with a sound like ripping canvas and exploded 50 yards behind them. "We gotta move!" O'Brien shouted. "That tank's gonna kill everyone in this sector!" Calvin's mind raced. The tank was too far for infantry weapons. No tank destroyers were in position to engage it. Artillery was engaged elsewhere. Someone had to stop it, or it would roll right through their lines. Then Calvin remembered something. The bazookas. 2 of them, in the platoon's weapons cache, 30 yards back. He'd watched veterans demonstrate them during training. Aim, squeeze triggers, rocket away. Effective range, 150 yards. Maximum range, 300 yards. The tank was 300 yards away. "Cover me!" Calvin shouted and ran. O'Brien thought he'd lost his mind, but laid down covering fire anyway. Calvin sprinted to the weapons cache, grabbed a bazooka and 3 rockets, and ran back. German small arms fire snapped past him. A mortar exploded nearby, showering him with frozen dirt. He slid into a shell crater, loaded the bazooka, and steadied it on the crater's rim. The Panther was 250 yards away now, still advancing. Calvin had never fired a bazooka before. He'd only watched the demonstration once. Through the sight, he centered the crosshairs on the tank's massive front armor. That wouldn't work. Frontal armor was too thick. He shifted his aim to the side, where the armor was thinner. The tank was moving. He'd have to lead the shot. Calvin exhaled slowly, the way his grandfather had taught him when shooting running game. Lead the target. Squeeze, don't jerk. Follow through. He fired. The rocket left the tube with a whoosh and a backblast that kicked snow up behind him. For what seemed like an eternity, Calvin watched the rocket arc through the air. The Panther's commander must have seen it because the tank started turning. The rocket hit the Panther's side armor just below the turret ring and penetrated. For a moment, nothing happened. Then orange fire erupted from every hatch. Secondary explosions followed as the tank's ammunition cooked off. The turret separated from the hull and tumbled sideways. The German infantry following that tank scattered in confusion. Calvin didn't wait to celebrate. He loaded another rocket and searched for targets. A second Panther had appeared from the tree line. Calvin fired, missed high and to the left. He loaded his last rocket, aimed more carefully, and fired again. Hit. The second Panther stopped dead, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. When Calvin's rockets were exhausted, he grabbed his rifle and ran back to his foxhole. O'Brien stared at him in disbelief. "Did you just kill 2 Panthers with a bazooka?" "I think so, Corporal." "You think so? Kid, I watched you do it. Where'd you learn to shoot a bazooka?" "I didn't. I just watched the demonstration that one time." O'Brien laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "You're either the luckiest son of a gun in the Army or the best natural soldier I've ever seen." The battle raged for another 4 hours. Without the 2 Panthers to spearhead their assault, the German attack lost momentum. American forces, fighting with desperate courage and the last of their ammunition, held every position. By 1100 hours, the Germans withdrew to regroup. The cost had been terrible. Calvin's company lost 32 men killed and 41 wounded out of 123 engaged. Every platoon was under strength. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. But they'd held. That afternoon, Captain Peters found Calvin cleaning his rifle. "Graham, what you did this morning was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen in this war. Maybe both. I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star." Calvin looked up, confused. "Sir, I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly why you're getting the medal." Peters paused. "How old are you, really?" Calvin met his eyes. 14, sir. I'll be 15 in April." So Peters closed his eyes and sighed deeply. 14. Jesus Christ. You're 14 years old, and you just destroyed 2 German tanks in combat. He sat down heavily on an ammunition crate. "After this is over, we're going to have a long talk about falsifying enlistment papers, but right now, I need every rifle I can get, so you keep your mouth shut about your age and stay alive. Understood?" "Wwii?" "Yes, sir." "And Graham, when this is over, you're going home. You've done enough." December 23rd brought the weather break that saved Bastogne. Clear skies meant airdrops. C-47 transport planes appeared overhead at 1000 hours, dropping supplies in multicolored parachutes. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, all came tumbling from the sky. Calvin watched with tears streaming down his face as boxes of ammunition thudded into the snow. They weren't going to run out. They weren't going to die from lack of bullets. The Air Force had saved them. That afternoon, resupplied and reinforced, the 101st went on the offensive. Calvin's platoon participated in a counterattack that pushed German forces back 800 yards. It was Calvin's first experience with offensive combat, and he learned that attacking was somehow even more terrifying than defending. But his instincts kept working. Twice he warned of German positions that others had missed. Once he spotted a camouflaged anti-tank gun that would have destroyed the Sherman tank supporting their advance. His warnings saved lives repeatedly. December the 26th brought the sound everyone had been waiting for: artillery fire from the south. Heavy, sustained, systematic. Patton's Third Army had broken through. The siege was over. When the first Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion rolled into Bastogne that afternoon, grown men wept. Calvin stood with his platoon, watching the relief force arrive, feeling emotions he couldn't name: pride, relief, exhaustion, grief for the friends who hadn't made it. The 101st Airborne Division had held Bastogne against overwhelming odds for 7 days. They'd fought outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded, and nearly out of ammunition. They'd refused to surrender when defeat seemed certain. And among them had been a 14-year-old farm boy from Texas who'd lied to get into uniform and accidentally become a hero. The official battle report credited Calvin Booker Graham with destroying 2 Panther tanks, identifying German infiltrators that prevented a breakthrough, and providing early warning that allowed defensive preparations to succeed. His scout mission had given headquarters the intelligence needed to position their limited forces effectively. The Bronze Star citation read, "For heroic achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy." It didn't mention that the hero was young enough to be in 8th grade. After Bastogne, Calvin's war changed. Captain Peters, true to his word, initiated paperwork for discharge based on fraudulent enlistment. But the process moved slowly through military bureaucracy. In the meantime, Calvin remained with the 506th PIR as they pursued German forces through Belgium and into Germany itself. He participated in the crossing of the Rhine, the capture of Berchtesgaden, and finally the occupation of Austria. He turned 15 in a foxhole outside Munich. His birthday present was a letter from his mother, forwarded through multiple addresses, asking if he was okay and begging him to write. He wrote back that he was fine. He didn't mention the nightmares, the friends he'd buried, or the German teenager he'd killed in a firefight outside Stuttgart, who'd looked exactly like him. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Calvin was still 14 days short of his 15th birthday. He'd been in combat for 5 months. He'd earned the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds received in January, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. His discharge came through on June 3, 1945. The paperwork cited fraudulent enlistment. Calvin Booker Graham, age 15, was released from active duty and sent home to Texas. He arrived in Polk County on June 12th to find his family's farm exactly as he'd left it. His father was still drinking. His mother was still quietly suffering. His younger siblings were still working fields that would never make them prosperous. But Calvin had changed. He couldn't explain what war had done to him, how it had stolen something vital while leaving him physically intact, how sounds made him jump, how he couldn't sleep without checking corners and exits, how civilian life felt simultaneously precious and meaningless. His parents never asked about his service. His father seemed almost resentful that Calvin had come home when so many others hadn't. His mother cried when she saw him, but said nothing about the scars or the look in his eyes. Calvin lasted 3 weeks before he ran away again, this time to Dallas, where he found work in a machine shop. The GI Bill would eventually send him to community college. The VA would eventually treat his combat trauma, though they called it shell shock back then. The men of the 506th PIR stayed in touch. O'Brien wrote letters that Calvin sometimes answered. Torres, who'd lost his leg to that gunshot wound, called on holidays. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd survived the war to become a lawyer, sent Christmas cards. They never forgot the kid who'd lied to join their ranks and save their lives. The full story of Calvin's service remained classified until 1968, when a researcher discovered the discrepancy between his enlistment papers and his actual age. By then, Calvin was 40 years old, married with 3 children, working as a mechanical engineer in Houston. A reporter tracked him down and asked about his service. Calvin, who'd spent 23 years trying to forget, finally told his story. The article ran in the Houston Chronicle under the headline, "Boy Soldier Saved Battalion at Bastogne." The publicity forced the Army to re-examine his service record. What they found embarrassed the military establishment. A 14-year-old had been allowed to enlist, deployed to combat, and awarded medals for valor. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. But the veterans of the 506th PIR rallied to Calvin's defense. Letters poured in from men who'd served with him, testifying to his courage, his instincts, his marksmanship. The battalion commander wrote directly to the Secretary of the Army. Calvin Graham may have lied about his age, but he never lied about his courage. He saved American lives repeatedly through instinct, skill, and bravery. The Army should honor him, not punish him. On November 11, 1977, the Army officially restored Calvin's medals and benefits. At a ceremony in Houston, now retired General Morrison personally pinned the Bronze Star on Calvin's chest for the 2nd time. "You've always been a soldier," Morrison said quietly. Age was just a number. Character is what counted. Calvin Booker Graham died January 6, 1992, at age 61. His obituary ran in major newspapers across the country. Youngest American combat soldier of World War II. The story of the farm boy who'd lied to fight and accidentally became a hero, but the numbers tell only part of the story. Calvin's instincts, born from hunting in Texas brush, had warned of German attacks before they developed. His early warnings had allowed American forces to prepare defenses that saved hundreds of lives. His destruction of 2 Panther tanks had stopped a breakthrough that could have shattered the American perimeter. The official Army study conducted in 1983 concluded that Calvin's actions at Bastogne contributed significantly to the successful defense. His scout mission provided intelligence that shaped American defensive planning. His warnings prevented German infiltration from succeeding. His tank kills eliminated armor support for the main assault. How many lives did he save? The study estimated between 300 and 500 American casualties prevented by Calvin's actions alone. The actual number might be higher. Battles are chaotic. Cause and effect blur together. But conservative estimates credit a 14-year-old farm boy with saving a significant portion of a battalion. After his death, veterans of the 101st Airborne established the Calvin Graham Memorial Scholarship for young people pursuing military service. The scholarship emphasizes character over age, potential over credentials, courage over conventional qualifications. Each year, the scholarship committee reads applications from young Americans who want to serve. They look for the qualities Calvin embodied: instinct, courage, selflessness, the ability to do what's needed when it's needed, regardless of personal cost. The farm boy who lied to join the Army never sought recognition. He spent most of his life trying to forget the war, but his accidental heroism at Bastogne ensured his story would endure. Today at the Bastogne War Museum, a small display tells Calvin's story. A photograph shows him at 15, wearing his uniform and medals, looking impossibly young. The caption reads, "America's youngest warrior, Bastogne's unlikely hero." Visitors often pause at the display, struck by the juxtaposition of youth and valor. How could someone so young face such horror? How could a child make decisions that saved hundreds of lives? The answer lies not in Calvin's age, but in his character. War doesn't ask birthdays. Combat doesn't check identification. When the moment comes, soldiers either rise to meet it or they don't. Calvin rose. He rose when he destroyed tanks he'd never been trained to fight. He rose when he crawled through German lines to gather intelligence. He rose when his instincts warned of dangers others couldn't perceive. He rose repeatedly, not because he was brave, though he was, but because men were counting on him. The irony of Calvin's story is profound. He lied to escape one kind of hell and found himself in another. But in that frozen hell at Bastogne, a scared kid from a Texas farm discovered something valuable: purpose, brotherhood, the knowledge that he mattered. His father's belt had told him he was worthless. The Army told him he was too young. Combat proved them both wrong. Calvin Booker Graham was exactly what America needed when it needed him most. The farm boy who should have been in ninth grade algebra class instead found himself calculating firing solutions for rockets. The kid who should have been worrying about homework instead worried about keeping his friends alive. The teenager who should have been at high school dances instead danced with death in a Belgian forest. And when it mattered most, when German tanks threatened to break through American lines and slaughter trapped paratroopers, a 14-year-old boy who'd grown up hunting rattlesnakes picked up a weapon he barely understood and saved hundreds of lives. That's the story they don't teach in history classes. The story of how lies can lead to truth, how youth can contain wisdom, how a child can save an army. Calvin Booker. Graham lied to join the Army. He was too young, too small, too inexperienced. By every regulation and standard, he should never have been there. But he was there, at Bastogne, in the frozen hell where America's best made their stand against overwhelming odds. And when the moment came, when everything hung in the balance, The youngest American soldier of World War II looked through a bazooka sight and changed history. He didn't plan to be a hero. He just wanted to escape his father's farm. But sometimes the smallest lies lead to the greatest truths. Sometimes the youngest hearts contain the oldest courage. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the moment requires. Calvin Booker Graham was 14 years old and he accidentally saved an entire battalion. Not because he was a soldier, because he was himself, brave, instinctive, unwilling to quit when quitting meant his friends would die. The farm boy lied to join the army. The army taught him to fight. Bastogne taught him to be a hero. And history remembers him not for his age or his lies, but for the moment when a kid who shouldn't have been there became exactly what America needed. That's the story. That's the truth. And that's why we remember Calvin Booker Graham, the farm boy who lied his way into history and accidentally saved hundreds of lives. In the frozen forests of Belgium, among the bravest generation, stood a 14-year-old child who proved that courage has no age limit, that heroism requires no permission, that sometimes the most unlikely people rise to the most impossible challenges. Calvin didn't seek glory, he sought escape. But he found something far more valuable. He found that he mattered, that his life had purpose, that when everything was at stake, a farm boy from Texas could make a difference. The army eventually forgave his lies. History honored his courage, and the men whose lives he saved never forgot the kid who shouldn't have been there, but was exactly where he needed to be. This is the story of Calvin Booker Graham, farm boy, liar, soldier, hero, the youngest American warrior who accidentally saved an entire battalion and proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody saw coming.